My name is Rufus Cartwright. I'm the subspecialty trainee in urogynecology at Oxford University Hospitals, and I'm giving this talk about different types of review, narrative reviews versus systematic reviews. And I'm approaching this topic both as an author of these reviews, as a consumer of these reviews, as an editor for these reviews, because I work for the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology as an editor, and also for the International Urogyne Journal. And editors love to receive reviews because they're highly cited, but in general they prefer systematic reviews, and this talk will tell you a little bit about why that is. I'm going to cover in this talk why systematic review is completely central to the practice of evidence-based medicine. I'm going to talk about why narrative reviews are important, but how they can get things completely wrong. I'm going to try to tell you when you should choose a systematic review over a narrative approach, and I'm going to try to define the methods that lie at the heart of a systematic approach. So the first topic, why systematic review is central to evidence-based medicine. It's obvious that there are vastly more papers published than any one clinician can read. That's even true in a narrow field like continence, where there are lots of small journals and many hundreds of papers to consume per year. If you look at any given paper, even in a very high-impact journal, it can have confusing or completely unclear results. It's also true that individual papers are often severely flawed, and that can be from biases in their design, in the way in which the studies were done, but most of all in the way in which they're reported. Even if you have good papers, papers that cover the same topic, papers that have high-quality methods, they can have completely conflicting results and conclusions, and it's hard to know how to bring them together. As clinicians, when we decide what to do for our patients, and as people who write guidelines, giving advice to other clinicians, we need some way to make the jump from this jumble of evidence to transparent and reproducible recommendations for practice. Systematic review is a broad church. There are many different approaches that still can be considered systematic review, but there is a quite simple core. It's a process of deciding and documenting how you're going to do a review. It's a process of collecting the evidence for the review in the way that you've already agreed, and then it's a process of summarizing that evidence with a predefined analysis plan, which may or may not include meta-analysis. Those three main things constitute systematic review. In contrast, narrative review doesn't have a plan, and that's the real reason why narrative review can get things completely wrong. A narrative review is an essay about a topic. They can be incredibly important, they can be incredibly influential. They can be used to drive a whole field forward by suggesting new areas for research or new topics. They can be used to distill incredible insights from experts in a field. And of course, as an introduction to a field, a narrative review can have tremendous educational value. But the problem is, the process by which a review is written can't be replicated. And because you can't know how the evidence was brought together, and really you can't tell how the evidence was analysed, you can't make your own judgment of the conclusions. And it's fair to say that in many cases, the conclusions of a narrative review can be so biased as to be completely incorrect. Now, I've certainly been an author of narrative reviews, and so when I say things about authors here, I'm not being mean, I'm just trying to say what I feel about writing these reviews. I think when you start out to write an essay about a topic, when you start out on a narrative review, you don't start with an open mind. You have ideas you want to put down on the page, you have a thesis you want to build towards, and it's natural that you're going to build towards things that support your existing beliefs. It's natural that you're going to cite studies that help you develop your arguments. And because of the way in which you build up these arguments in a narrative review, you're going to end up deriving recommendations and conclusions that aren't grounded in the totality of relevant evidence. Even if you have a very broad overview in your review, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to account for the uncertainty about the sources of evidence that you've included. So, when should you choose systematic review instead of narrative review? Well, increasingly, systematic review is used to define a gap in the evidence. When you're trying to set a research agenda, there's nothing better than a systematic review to show where the gaps lie. If you're applying for a big grant, it's great to start out with a systematic review to show that how your study will contribute to a field. If you're writing a PhD thesis, instead of writing a narrative introductory chapter, you can do a systematic review, get a publication, and show how your studies will contribute to weaknesses in the field. It's also true when there is existing evidence and the evidence is clear, but you need to develop guidelines that will be widely adopted and respected, then systematic review is a great way to bring together that evidence That'll help your guideline be read and understood, and so systematic review is at the core of all major guideline bodies in the present day. And then in general, whenever there's a research question with conflicting studies or uncertainty about what the evidence shows, then systematic review is a way of bringing them together, even if they suggest different things, and arriving at a central agreed truth about those studies. So the process of systematic review. The first step is absolutely to define the research question. We often hear about randomized trials, how you have to define the PICO for the trial, the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcomes. And that's also true for systematic review. But actually what you need to define in your system for doing the review is broader than that. You need to think about the objectives of the review. And that covers many different things. You want to think about the single intervention or interventions that you're going to cover. You want to think about the population of patients or population in general that are going to be treated or assessed. And that may include the setting in which the intervention will apply. Very much, you need to consider the types of evidence or studies that will help you answer the question. In some areas, there are going to be many large randomized control trials that help answer it well, and those are the studies that you'll want to include, and you can ignore the observational evidence. But for some types of research question, there will be no randomized trials, or it may be that observational evidence provides a better answer, and then you'll want to go primarily to those studies. The last thing you want to assess is the outcomes that you're going to assess. This sounds straightforward, but actually you don't want to go looking in the papers and then decide what outcomes you're going to include. You want to decide before you've done the data extraction which outcomes you're going to extract and how you're going to deal with them in your review, how you're going to analyse them. I want to say something very important, which is that we should really be registering our review protocols, and I would recommend doing this in a database called Prospero. It's free to use, and it serves two main purposes. Firstly, for the consumers of your review, and in that I include the peer reviewers, the editors, and the readers of your review. They want to know that you stuck to the protocol that you said you would stick to when you did the review, and they'll be able to see that because the protocol is prospectively registered. But secondly, having your review protocol up online while you're doing a review helps minimize duplication of research. There can be different teams working on the same question. Instead of working separately, they could come together to answer the question together, if only they knew they were working on the same review. And that is a very real problem in the present day. The second step is obviously to go and search the literature. Now, for many clinical questions, PubMed will have the vast majority of papers you want to include, but depending on your subject area, there may be other important databases to assess, and it's clear that covering multiple databases will bring more studies into your review potentially. You need to consider whether you'll include conference abstracts in your review. It can be very difficult to bring together this grey literature, but unfortunately, even in the field of continence, up to half of abstracts presented will never make it to publication, and that can include important studies, so you should consider including conference abstracts. When you've included studies in your review, you should search through the reference lists of those studies, and unfortunately or fortunately, you'll often find that you find more studies that way. You need to decide which studies will fit predefined inclusion criteria. You need to do something sensible to exclude duplicate studies, and you need to do something sensible with overlapping studies that have included the same patients or participants twice or assessed them at different times. At some point, you need to assess the quality of each study or the risk of bias, and in a separate talk in this series, Carrie Tignan talks about the grade methodology for doing just this. At this stage, you need to go out then and extract the relevant data. Often this will be done in duplicate to minimize errors, but you need to record the data you said you would record, put it down in standardized ways in a database, and then often you'll need to go and contact the authors of the primary studies for clarifications. Sometimes it will be clear to you that there is important data that's missing from the publications, and many authors will be happy to provide you with data if you only go and ask. Step 3 is to combine the data. I'm not going to talk about how you do meta-analysis, but often in a systematic review, you will hope to reach meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is where you bring together a range of smaller studies into one large analysis. And the main benefit is that the large pooled sample size from the different studies helps you get more precise results. But it depends on having consistency between the primary studies. They need to have assessed the same research question, and they need to have measured things in similar ways, or you'll get nonsensical results. If you only have poor quality studies, or you have very heterogeneous data and heterogeneous outcomes, then you need to revert to a narrative synthesis. Here, it's not just a narrative review of the data though. you need to systematically lay out the evidence from these studies that can't be combined and deal with each study fairly with equal consideration of the evidence they provide. Step 4 is possibly the least important part of systematic review. You do need to put the findings into context, but in a systematic review, you don't do much editorializing. Your main job is to bring the data together, show what the data shows, and then discuss the quality and the heterogeneity of the included studies. You do want to discuss how the studies apply to the population you intended it to apply to, but in the main, the consumers of your review and the people who are writing guidelines will be the ones that translate your evidence into recommendations. So in summary, narrative reviews have a very important place in education and in furthering scientific discourse, but often the conclusions reached from narrative reviews don't reflect the real evidence. Systematic reviews, on the other hand, are a way that different researchers and different clinicians can coalesce around a kind of truth based on the totality of evidence, and that makes them an absolutely key component of current evidence-based medical practice. Systematic review can be done in many ways, but at the core of systematic review are explicit methods for finding evidence, combining that evidence, and then appraising its quality. Thank you very much.